Welcome to On the Ground with Joe Trippi, the new Lincoln Square podcast where we talk to people who actually know what's going on the ground in key battleground states and elections. This is the fourth of our episodes on the ground in Texas. We've talked to some legendary Texan political insiders, so go check out those episodes. But today we finally get to a much younger perspective. My guest today is Jasper Scherer, political editor of Texas Tribune. Jasper began covering Texan politics after graduating in 2017, worked his way through the ranks at the Houston Chronicle and San Antonio Express News before landing at the Tribune. Jasper oversees a newsroom that's split between Texas and Washington, which makes him the perfect person to talk to about what the hell is going on in Texas politics. But first, I just heard that you got married at the end of April. So congratulations, Jasper.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, no, that's good. Good research, good scouting report. No, I appreciate it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, congrats. And listen, so we've had, some folks that have been around for a while, and you started covering this stuff in 2017 or so. So I think you've got a different perspective on what's happening. I want to get your take. I mean, so what we're looking for is, we're trying to get people who would like to understand what's going on in Texas politics and how that may play out in November, sort of on the ground view from different perspectives, and so we've had 3 or 4. You're our final episode, and wanted to get, start out with your take, just your overview of what's happening in Texas this year.
Well, you mentioned that I've been here since 2017. I the Beto O'Rourke fueled wave that and I say wave in the sense that he lost the state, but still, ended up having these coattails that produced a number of pretty significant down ballot Democratic flips. So that was kind of my first, full election cycle in the state. And, I think that is instructive in some ways in that, there are, of course, a number of parallels that you could point to with the way things are shaping up, this election cycle. And I think, in sort of the intervening election years, 2020, 2022, 2024, you saw the Democrats have been in the wilderness out here for so long, and, Beto coming along and giving them this jolt of hope, I think kind of ended up getting a lot of Democrats out over their skis. They face planted on a number of, just in a number of ways following that 2018 year. And now we're kind of arriving back to this point, 2026, where it's sort of the first glimmer of hope, I think, for Democrats that, they can sort of, feel comfortable starting to think maybe there's a return to actually like gaining ground in the state house down here. And, actually, ironically coming off of a kind of a blowout, 2024 where Trump carried the state handily, Colin Allred, of course, falling short against Ted Cruz. So it's interesting that this sense of optimism is coming for Dems coming off such a, string of tough cycles. But, I think it's, if you sort of think of it as like bookending this period of, tough years for Democrats, but, 2018, not that long ago. And I think some folks here have, they're thinking back to 8 years ago and looking at maybe a lot of parallels shaping up, and we'll see.
Well, yeah, Texas has sort of been for Democrats loosey in the football. We're about to kick and it gets pulled away. Do you think that optimism this time around, I mean, from a reporter's perspective, is warranted? I mean, are there reasons why you why what you're seeing makes sense that maybe this time, will be different, or is it a parallel with Beto in the same way, where, again, we're already seeing them come after Talarico like there's no, with vicious attacks. Why is it happening? Is it because Talarico is so charismatic? I mean, what's going on that's different? Or is it all the problems that Trump and the Republicans have faced after they've had power all this time?
Yeah, it's. I think it's anyone who's telling you with certainty like what's going to happen is is full of it. I think there's, but if we think about what we do know right now, there are definitely some signs that this. I'm not going to say like for sure it's Texas is going to go blue or is on the cusp, right. But this, you have Ken Paxton at the top of the ticket, and it's going to be kind of the first test for him of his supporters will often point to the fact that he has run statewide 3 times now and won, two of those times like overwhelmingly, I think by double digits. So, but on the other hand, this is going to be the first time where he's the guy carrying the mantle at the top of the ticket. And he has of course, I think it's pretty well known at this point, just the sort of range of legal and sort of I guess personal baggage that has followed him, some of which has been resolved in his favor, some of which is still kind of hanging out there. But bottom line, that trail of legal issues is going to follow him on the campaign trail. And there are also some, you look at his strength as a campaigner, he has not really had to raise the kind of money that you need to put up, for any statewide, Senate race in Texas, much less against someone like James Talarico, who's putting up these pretty historic fundraising numbers. And, Paxton also just hasn't had to hit the stump, as often. He'll presumably face some pressure to debate. These are all things that he hasn't really, had to do running a little bit further down the ballot. So I think that's one reason Democrats are looking at this with some optimism. I think it's, some of it's the economic conditions that especially, I think if you look at Texas, one of the big narratives, or one of the big headlines from Texas over the last few years has been this really striking, dramatic shift of Latino voters who are, by the way, forming a significant coalition in pretty much all of the battleground congressional districts in the state this cycle. So that's another matter. But they're such a critical voting bloc here, and they also, all the polling that we've seen over the years and continuing into this year is that they are, of course, they're not a monolith, but it's that being said, Latino voters are driven by economic concerns, by their pocketbooks, by issues that touch their pocketbooks, healthcare, housing. So that's that the fact that Latino voters are such a critical voting bloc in a period of it's going to be a tough potential economic cycle for Republicans. Latino voters also happen to be highly critical in Texas. You combine that with, a Republican at the top of the ticket who's, got more baggage than usual. I think that's what's driving some of the Democratic optimism.
And then walk us through redistricting a little bit. I mean, we've talked about this on the other, but getting your perspective. Because they drew these lines, we know, based on 2024, terms about how Trump did with Latinos and how he did with independents, et cetera, back then. And that, there's been, at least in most of the polling I've seen nationally and in Texas, that's shifted. It's not the same. So those it's not quite clear that those 5 districts are necessarily going to all vote, be held by Republicans at the end of it. And even just the grab itself, is that has that had any impact on voters, or they just don't? It's redistricting. We don't care. We don't understand it anyway.
Yeah, that's a good question. I did see some recent polling that started to get at that issue, but off the top of my head, I don't think my understanding is that's not making waves with voters to the point that it could I wouldn't expect it to be like a driving force in November. But it's I think there is this sense that I mentioned earlier. So there are these 5 districts that are currently held by Democrats that Republicans are attempting to flip with this new map. There are also a couple of seats that are currently held by Republicans that Democrats, I think, are suddenly not so sudden anymore, but they found themselves coming into the coming off of the map redraw once it was sort of starting to come into focus, this potential shift back to the left among Latino voters. I think beyond those 5 Republican targets, I think Democrats are starting to think maybe we can actually play a little offense and go after one of those seats being the district that's Texas 23, held by up until recently Tony Gonzalez, who was making headlines for a sex scandal with a former staffer. So that district is kind of a wacky shape, going for all the way from San Antonio to El Paso, but that's a Hispanic majority district, as is Texas's 15th congressional district, held by Monica de la Cruz, who's kind of been the one of the top Democratic targets in a otherwise, for lack of a better option, just because of how surgically gerrymandered or redistricted the state has been. She's been sort of the only realistic shot for Democrats. She represents a border district that goes down to the Rio Grande Valley. So those 2 Republican seats, I think, are legitimate. Are going to legitimately be on Democrats' radar this fall. And then I think if there's any meaningful shift to the left, then with Latino voters, Democrats are probably going to feel pretty good about their chances of holding on to Henry Cuellar's seat and Vicente Gonzalez's seat. Those are those are both down also in the Valley and other parts of South Texas. So it's to your point about maybe all 5 of the targets not ultimately being flipped. I think there's at least those 2 incumbents who could be in good position down in the Valley, and then maybe Democrats actually starting to think about offsetting losses with pickups of their own.
And what are you seeing in terms of younger voters, their energy, or where they're going in the state? I mean, look, there's 2 groups that we know. Independents have definitely been, I think, in most of the polling, moving towards Democrats in this cycle right now, because whether it's economic or whatever. The same with Latinos, have been moving in that direction. And I think in most polls in other states, younger voters are also starting to move towards the Democrats, away from Trump and MAGA for various different reasons. But are you seeing any of that, or is it too early to tell?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to think of, just off the top of my head, like the crosstabs on the most recent polling. I think it's just generally speaking, there's been a bit of a shift. In part of that is that cohort of younger voters notably moved to the right during the 2024 election. So I think some of this might be kind of a reversion to the mean, so to speak. But I mean, one other interesting thing to watch with younger voters in Texas, but maybe in especially other kind of red-leaning states, is this this sense that there was a big surge in enthusiasm among young conservatives, in kind of political activism and energy in the wake of Charlie Kirk's assassination. That was one thing that we were seeing, was kind of this big burst of younger conservative groups on college campuses, including, Charlie Kirk's organization, Turning Point, really going all out with these, new voter registrations. And, it's interesting that came along, after the last few cycles when the sort of the big force on the left trying to, mobilize young voters and get folks registered to vote on college campuses was Beto O'Rourke's political action committee that he formed after his runs for office. So, I think now we're kind of seeing like both sides are attempting to break through the long running kind of voter apathy among young folks. And I think that's something we'll want to do more reporting on over the next several months is, beyond just where like young voters are trending, among the folks who are already like registered or likely to vote, like how much new registration is happening on both sides of the aisle.
Does Talarico have more? I mean, it seems to me Beto attracted some of them. Does Talarico have, is the juxtaposition between Paxton and Talarico something that you think, let's get into that a little bit because we haven't talked much about Talarico yet. I mean, they're coming after him with, Telefrico, vegan fighting words, the whole thing. But he's clearly, I think, broken through. I mean, with young people, with independents, with and so I just want to get your take on how how you see, including does Paxton get all those Cornyn voters, or do some of them stay home, or can Talarico? There's a lot of stuff in flux there because of the uniqueness of who Paxton is and who Talarico is. I would think.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think another factor that puts a lot up in the air is just, Paxton is coming off this kind of grueling months-long, mudslinging against John Cornyn, where, the Republicans really haven't had, this is kind of our first look at the, now that Republicans are turning their attention to Talarico, like, what are their attacks looking like? How is he responding? So I think, he's probably benefited a little bit, maybe a little more than a little bit up to this point from just not having the Republicans like training their attention on him. So, I think and also I've seen the point made that there's been some initial polling that suggests a lot of John Cornyn's voters are going to either vote for Talarico or at least give him a look. Again, just coming off of this really bitter intra-party fighting, I wonder how many of those those Republicans will still have the same impression, as we get closer to the election, as the primary kind of recedes in memory. So, I think there's a combination of those things that, we haven't seen, the Republicans, whether it's Paxton's campaign or the, Senate GOP leadership who we're seeing this week are kind of linking arms with Paxton. So that the money cavalry is coming. Once we see the attack ads against Talarico and Republicans start to kind of forget about some of the nasty stuff that was said during the primary, I could see some of Talarico's, negatives start to go up. I mean, we kind of saw this with Colin Allred in 2024 as well. His favorability started off looking pretty strong, and by the end, it was just a very hyper partisan, hyper polarized electorate. So, but at the other side of the coin, there is Talarico is running this, very explicitly, kind of populist, economic focused campaign where he's talking about, top versus bottom, us versus them, sort of billionaires versus the rest of us. That message, combined with, where he's, putting his religion at the forefront of his campaign. You mentioned kind of the uniqueness of Paxton as his opponent. Paxton has run into, as we were talking about, just some ethical slip-ups, you might say. And if Talarico can sort of arrive at the right message where he's digging into Paxton on some of his more checkered history, while kind of contrasting that with this message of a progressive version of Christianity that sort of stands for everything that Ken Paxton is not, that kind of stuff. You could see that resonating with folks who are maybe more in the independent, like, swing voter realm, but it's just so early. We haven't seen much money spent against Talarico that hard to say what he's going to look like, say, in October, once early voting starts.
Yeah, we were talking earlier, and someone made the point that Republicans haven't really, except maybe Beto, haven't really had to run against anybody. I mean, there's never been, there hasn't been sort of like Paxton. He hasn't actually had. The fights have always been in the primaries because they were going to win the general anyway. So it's not like they've got a playbook other than culture stuff that obviously they're going to roll at Talarico. What do you? The one thing that we have seen, though, I think, and you saw this in some of the specials in Texas, is where Democrats were overperforming what you would normally expect. I mean, it happened across the country, but it definitely happened in Texas too. And then in the runoff, you had them spend all these millions of dollars beating up on each other, and those negative ads led to almost no turnout in the runoff. And so I understand, people forget, and by November, but it seems to me that all that, the negative pounding on each other definitely has taken some of the steam out of people can't wait to get to the polls, et cetera. Particularly as I don't see gas prices or any of those things changing dramatically between now and November. So a lot of the things that are bothering people and getting them to, I guess what I'm sort of getting into is, given how long it's been since what Republicans have been in charge, how much of this isn't necessarily a blue wave, but just change. Like it's just they've been in charge for so long, and they and we don't think they're going to lose anyway, so no one's going to so why vote? And the Democratic energy with Talarico. I mean, does any of that make sense, or is this me doing too much hopium about what could happen?
I mean, potentially. No, but I think it's a good point that you think back to these other cycles, like when, for example, Ted Cruz running in 2018 against Beto O'Rourke, he didn't have a competitive primary to speak of that he was coming. None of these folks were really damaged goods, so to speak. They were all coming out unscathed with having had however many months to build up their war chests. So I think that certainly is another factor that could contribute. I think on the topic of just how long Republicans have been in charge here, if anything, it's maybe less a sense of complacency that could come up this election. I think there are a lot of signs that you just kind of see the intensity of the reaction on the right to Talarico. Once the Republican primary was over, they all, as I was saying, kind of shifted their attention to Talarico, and it's been pretty intense round of knives out right out of the gate. That's something you probably wouldn't see from a party that's resting on its laurels and not taking it seriously. I think if anything, the result of Republicans being in power for so long in Texas, it has created this, led to the kind of a situation where, how do I put this? The state legislature has adopted a lot of very conservative policies lately. There are not all of which, enjoy consistent majority opinion in public polling and statewide, even in a state like Texas. And you've got some nominees on the ballot who swing. I mean, it's probably the most, kind of hard right GOP ticket statewide that Texas has ever produced. Paxton leading the ticket, and then of course Governor Abbott, when he was last on the ballot in 2022, had not signed into law a whole lot of these bills that he has since put his name on in the 4 years since, that have pushed the state even further to the right. We also have some folks in sort of lesser known races further down the ballot. One name that comes to mind, Beau French, is the former chair of the Tarrant County GOP. He's running for a seat on the Railroad Commissioner the Railroad Commission, which is the kind of whatever the opposite of aptly named is. It's they regulate the oil and gas industry here, but a lot of folks probably won't pay attention to that race or even know who the nominees are. But Beau French has a history of making some, I guess you could say, what critics would call racially charged comments. He's landed himself in hot water from even members of his own party, including with Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick calling for him to step down over some of those comments. So there's I think what I'm getting at here in sort of a long-winded way is the effect of the party being in power for so long is that in a lot of respects, the primaries kind of have become the sense is if you can get out of the Republican primary, you're going to get elected statewide because you're going to go up against the Democrats who haven't won in 30 years. And that, the state, the Republican primaries here they're typically very low turnout. The, hard right has been ascendant in recent years, no thanks in small part to Paxton's influence on the party. So I think the makeup of the Republicans running statewide is probably, it's fair to say, more conservative, further to the right than we've ever seen in the state. And it's just a matter of, where the chips fall in November in reaction to that.
Yeah, well, that's probably the problem writ large with redistricting, because once only thing you have to worry about is your primary, then it's the only thing you have to worry about is who's to the right of you, or if you're a Democrat, who's to the left. It goes both ways. But clearly, in a place like Texas, that's resulted in people, in the base electing more and more right, appealing to the base, making sure no one can outflank you to your right, and that's produced some of these kinds of nominees. I think like your railroad commissioner, if I remember right, he was asking people in the state what's worse, Jews or Muslims or something like that. I mean, he had these kind of racist statements, clear xenophobia.
And that was, by the way, that was the comment I was referring to that prompted Dan Patrick, the highly conservative lieutenant governor, to call for French to step down. So that's but interestingly, now the pretty much all the Republicans that I've seen have been coming out in support of French, saying basically we got to, now's the time to like our inter-party warfare is over. Now's the time to unify and look toward November. So anyway.
Well, I'm sure there'll be committees out there reminding people of these things, though, regardless of how they're, the Republicans will be reminding everybody about Talarico and his vegan girlfriend or whatever the hell they're gonna throw, but they're definitely jumping in. We're getting down towards the end. I just wanted to give you a chance to tell people if they're interested in learning more about Texas politics, and where can they, what's the URL or wherever they can find things that reporting that you guys are doing.
No, I appreciate the opportunity for that. Yeah, I mean, our website, texastribune.org, We're putting out new stuff every day. We're going to be aggressively covering all of these statewide races and the congressional battlegrounds, all the way down to the state house. We're a nonprofit newsroom, which means no paywall. So for especially folks who are interested in following this stuff, from outside the boundaries of Texas, where it might not make sense for you to, drop a bunch of money on a subscription. We're here to provide you with the news. We'll be covering it from all angles: accountability, forward reporting, covering campaign finance, talking to voters on the ground. And it'll all be at texastribune.org. So would love, if anyone listening to this is interested in what we've been talking about, just give us a look.
Yeah, no, that's what we're trying to do. We're just trying to present 3 or 4 different views of what's going on. So people, if they get interested, they can, and they're interested in following Texas, which I think is going to be a major story this year. And regardless of which way it goes, it's going to be a major story. And so, Jasper, really appreciate you coming on. Texas Tribune, and folks interested, follow them. And chip in a little bit too if you can. And really grateful that you came on and gave us your perspective.
Of course. Thanks for having me, Joe. Appreciate it.